Hey guys, how's it going? Now, the last video, I was explaining the resources that you need to find if you're going to start building pedals. So I went over a lot of options, and like I said, it depends on where you are in the world. You know, maybe your city or town has an electronics outlet or something that you can go to for a lot of these parts. Or maybe you have to order online, and I mean, ordering online is great, and different places have different things, but yeah, it's ultimately whatever makes it easier for you. But I mentioned at the end of the video that we would be doing the Mr. Black Boost Tiger, so I will show you what that looks like right about now, and you'll see I got it from, once again, Tagboard Effects is one of my favorite places to go for Vero board layouts. And like I said, I use Vero board, so that's what we're going to be doing here. So there's a few things that we need to do to prepare. Obviously, we need to collect all the parts that we need, and that includes a piece of Vero board. And as it shows in the layout there, it's 15 by 10, which is the number of holes. So in this case, it's 15 holes long and 10 holes wide. So 10 is the row number and 15 is the column number, basically. So I went ahead and cut a piece already right here. This is what 10 by 15 looks like. So you can see we have, maybe you can see, there we go. So you can see we have 10 rows and 15 columns. So we're going to be using that. And I also have I've collected all the parts I need to build it here. It's nothing too serious. So when you're collecting parts, I mean, for an effect like this, it's not really too bad. You can just look at it and see what you need. But some of these effects get really big, and it gets hard to keep track of what you need. So one thing that I tend to do on like a bigger project is I will print the picture of the layout, and then that way I can cross off each individual component as I collect it. So that'll keep you straight when you're trying to figure out what you need. And I mean, if you go to some place like Mad Bean, or you know, and you order a printed circuit board, a lot of times they'll come with a list of instructions that includes a bill of materials, which is nice. But like I said, in this case, you can just look at it and see what you need and grab it. So now that we have everything collected, the first step is to prepare the Vero board. And what I mean by that is, as you can see, once again, on the bottom of the picture, it shows you, it says 15 by 10, 4 links, 9 cuts. And what that means is that there's 4 places on the board that you're going to need to put a jumper, and there's 9 places that you need to cut the copper track so that it breaks the connection there. So all those little red squares are the cuts. Now, when you look at this, especially in the top picture, you're looking at it as if you were looking down on the Vero board. So, and I mean, you can see some of the places where the cuts are on the top picture, but the bottom picture removes all the components so you can see the cuts and the links exactly where you need to make them. Now the thing about that is you're still looking at it from the top down, and I mean from this side. The copper traces are going to be underneath when you're looking at this. So when you make those cuts, you need to make them on the opposite side. Now that, it's a little tricky that way. What I mean is, what we're going to do is we're going to take that bottom picture, and you can do it in any free program like Paint.net or GIMP or whatever you have. You can do it in Photoshop. I mean, you don't need Photoshop to do it, but all you do is you take the bottom part of that picture and flip it horizontally. and then you can draw on your piece of vero board where the cuts need to be made from the reverse picture. So I'm going to do that and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, now, so I've marked out where I need to make the cuts. And you'll notice on this, if I can get it to focus here. Now you'll notice if you look at this and you look at the picture, this is reversed from what the picture shows. And the reason for that is when we turn it around this way and mount all the parts to it, because the parts are going to be mounted on this side and they're going to be connected on this side. So when we mount all the parts on this side, all the cuts will be in the right place, as if you're looking at the picture top down. So that was kind of a convoluted explanation, but hopefully it makes sense. I'm probably over explaining it, but anyway. So having made those marks on the copper, that'll show you exactly where to cut. Now what I tend to do is I will also make marks on the top, just so that I know where all the cuts are on the top and I don't have to overthink when I flip it back and forth when I'm soldering. So I'm going to make the marks on the top just for my own orientation purposes, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have the marks on the top now so that we're going to know the proper orientation, so we don't have to guess every time we flip the board back and forth. And it's also good to do it this way so that you can see where to put the links and not have to count out holes. You can see easily where the links are going to go just by looking at the picture. So now, on the reverse side, on the copper side, we're going to have to make these cuts. Now you can buy tools, and I think I have one here. So you can buy a tool like this, and this is a track cutter. It looks like a screwdriver, but the very tip of it is almost shaped like a drill, but it's very flat on top. And you can use this to cut the copper tracks. It's okay. I don't really like doing that because it's time consuming and it's labor intensive, especially if you have a lot of tracks to cut. Like this one only has 9 cuts. I've done ones that have over 30 or more, and that gets tedious with that track cutter. So what I do is I have one of these, which is a step bit for a drill, and these come in different sizes as well. I have 3 different sizes that I use, and I use these for drilling out the enclosure, but I also use them to cut the tracks, because I can mount this onto my drill and I just go about that slow to cut the tracks. So I don't, because I'm not trying to drill all the way through the board, I just want to cut the copper off. So we'll do that. So when you cut the tracks, here's what you're trying to end up with. And a good thing to do is to hold it up against a light, kind of like this, so that you can tell that the copper has been cut all the way across. So you don't want any little strands of copper that are still connected. And if you do, you just run the drill over it a little bit longer. And as you can see, the drill doesn't go down that deep. It's just enough to get rid of that copper. And that's all we're trying to achieve. And using the drill just basically saves your hands and saves time. It's a lot faster that way. Okay, so now that we have the board prepared, the next thing we need to do is to solder in all the links. Now this one has 4 links, and you might be looking at the picture saying to yourself, wait a minute, I only see 3. But you see that little note at the bottom that says note double link in a single hole. So that little blue dot shows you that there's actually 2 links in that one line. So it goes from the top row to the 4th row, and then the 4th row to the 5th row. So that's 2 separate links. They both link in the center hole there where the blue dot is. So I'll show that. Now when you're making links, as long as they're fairly short, you can use old leads. So anytime you solder in, say, a resistor or a capacitor or whatever, and you solder it through the board, you clip off the lead. If the lead's fairly long, I always set them aside. So I have a lot of extra leads because they make good links, especially underneath sockets or anything like that. So I have a bunch of these laying around, so I'll use them for the links. So I'll get that done and I'll be right back. So it should look something like this. So as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 links, and those two share that hole there in the center. So that makes it, like I said, writing the cuts on the front as well as the back when you're getting ready to cut them makes a good reference so you can see where the links go. So on the back, we're just going to solder the links in place and then we'll move on. Alright, so we've soldered and clipped the leads, and it should look something like that. Now, one thing to be careful of, especially when you're using vero board, is when you solder, make sure that all the solder stays on whatever track that you're soldering. And that can be a big problem with using vero board for your projects if you're not careful. Sometimes you can get tiny little minuscule pieces of solder or pieces of lead or something that ends up connecting one row to another row when it's not supposed to be. So one good thing to get in practice of is to take your soldering iron, whenever you're finished soldering something, take your soldering iron and stick it in between the tracks and just run it along all the solder joints, and that tends to separate everything and make sure that it's separated. So if you have grounding problems or something's not connected right, try that first. Make sure all your rows are separated. Okay, so now we have a prepared board for this build. Now when I do builds, I install all the parts in a very specific order. So the first thing I do is I install all the sockets that I'm going to need first. And sockets can look like this. They're little, they're sockets for chips or sockets for transistors. Whatever sockets you have or whatever sockets you're going to use, I always put those in first. Because sometimes if you put parts in first and then try to put the socket in over it, some of your parts might be squished against it a little too tight and it doesn't fit. So I always do the sockets first to get them out of the way. The other good thing about sockets is when you use them for, you tend to use sockets for sensitive parts such as transistors or chips. So the good thing is that you can solder in the socket and leave the chip out till the very last, so that there's no danger of you overheating the chip or overheating the transistor or whatever. You can put them in at the very last and you don't have to use any solder at all to connect them. So it always comes in real handy. Now sockets tend to have really short legs and they can be a pain to try to get them to stay on the board while you solder them. So one thing I do is I use this stuff, which is blue tack or poster tack. It's called a bunch of different things and it's in different colors, but it's basically a sticky sort of thing that's normally used for mounting posters or pictures on the wall without using thumbtacks. It's very stretchy, it's a lot like putty. So all you have to do is put it on whatever part you need to solder and it will hold it in place. Alright, so now once your sockets are in, the next thing I like to install is everything that's going to be pretty much flat against the board. And so I mean the really low profile parts, such as resistors, diodes, trying to think of anything else. Basically anything that sits flat against the board. But most often it's just resistors and diodes, so I do that next. Alright, so with all the resistors now soldered onto the board, the next thing we do is solder the capacitors on. And with capacitors, you usually separate them into things like film capacitors, which look like this, or small box types, basically anything non-polarized, or ceramic ones like this. I tend to do the ceramics first because they're usually the smallest, followed up by things like this or the box types, and lastly the electrolytics, because they're usually the biggest. So you see the theme here. We're going from the lowest profile to the largest profile. So I'm going to solder the capacitors on the board and then I'll be right back. Alright, so as you can see, we have basically a completed board. There we go. And I've done what I usually do in I take the capacitors and I tend to bend them over as much as I can, because it reduces the height of the board, and the board is generally sitting above a pot, so there's not usually a whole lot of room between the top of the board and the bottom of the enclosure. So I tend to bend everything over just to make it that much more low profile, if I can. So the only thing left to do is hook up all the wires on the board as it specifies. So if we look at the layout again, the boost potentiometer is going to be connected on the left side there. Now when it says boost 2 and 3, it means that the second and third lugs of the potentiometer are going to be connected together, and then one of them is going to be connected to that spot. So we'll do that, and then as you can see underneath it is where the input's going to go. On the right hand side, 9 volt ground, the output, and they've even included a positive terminal for your LED indicator. That doesn't always happen, and I'll get to that in a later video, but that's kind of a cool little addition. So let me hook those up for you and I'll show you how it looks when I'm done. Okay guys, now if we look at that schematic one more time, we'll see something pretty much like this if we match it up. So as you can see, the pot's all connected, and I like to twist the wires, or twist any wires together really that I can if they're gonna be close together. So we have the pot, we have the input wire here, 9 volt, this is the red, the black is the ground, and the yellow is the output. I've omitted the LED wire because I usually like to do that when I'm getting closer to finishing the enclosure, so I'll do that on a later video. So all that's left to do is install the chip in the socket, and then we can hook this up and test it. Now it's very, very important that you test everything that you build before you put it in a box. And that's there's 2 reasons for that. Number 1, you want to know if your effect is working at all before you put it in a box. Number 2, if you box it up and it doesn't work, if you tested it beforehand and it did work, then you'll know that there's a problem with your offboard wiring and not a problem with your circuit. So I can't stress that enough. Make sure you test everything first before you put it together, or before you put it in a box anyway. So yeah, anyway, that's going to be it for this video. The next video, I'll hook up my testing rig and I'll show you what that looks like. We'll test it out, and then we will start getting an enclosure ready. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this was informative for you and at least gives you some insight in how I build pedals. If anything was confusing, or if I left something out, or you're not too sure about something, please let me know in the comments. And if I can't answer in the comments, then I'll dedicate a video just for that. So anyway, thanks again for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.